My name is Jill Derby, and some of you know me from many years on the Nevada Board of Regents and my long-term political work in Nevada. And also what you don't know is Derby Dam up Highway 80 is my great-grandfather's land that he donated. So those are some things I'd say, but I graduated from UC Davis with a PhD in cultural anthropology, and my focus was the Middle East, Arabic, my language. And so I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. More recently, I was appointed to the board of trustees of the American University of Iraq up in Iraqi Kurdistan, the northern Kurdish region of Iraq. And since then, I've become the chair of the board. I was the vice chair for 4 years, serving under Barham Saleh, who currently is the president of Iraq. So when he was elected president of Iraq, I moved up to be the board chair of the American University of Iraq in Iraqi Kurdistan. And that has had me there over the last 6 or 7 years. And although the Kurds weren't a specialty, the Middle East was. I know that region of the world, and it's just been wonderful to be back there and with such an inspiring project as is the American University. Before I get started on my talk, I want to just give 3 prefacing comments. And the first one is I'll be covering a lot of territory. It's a broad topic. It's a semester course. So I'm going to have to hit highlights and move on. But I want to cover, 100 years of history and explain about the Kurds. I know there's a lot of contemporary interest in the Kurds, given what's gone on over the last decade, the role they've played in defeating ISIS more currently, what's gone on with the Syrian Kurds and how we were allies and partners and let them down pretty majorly in October, November. But I'm not going to focus much right now on contemporary issues. I'm happy to take all that in questions afterwards. I'll make references, but in order to give you a broader sense of who the Kurds are, their place in the Middle East, that history that's so critical for not only them, but for everybody in the Middle East, the last 100 years of history. But I want to tell you that I'm also, at the end, going to hit on a couple of bright lights, because the Middle East has been a pretty grim place for quite some time. And it just gets grimmer by the day. We now have 600,000 Syrian refugees heading out because of the murderous bombardment of Assad and his ally, the Russians, bombing hospitals and schools and anything they can find. So a whole new wave of refugees. They've already been nearly 6 million. Turkey's absorbed 3.5 million, and this group of 600,000, you can check the international news and see those caravans of people loading up everything they have and heading north. At the end, I'm going to talk about one of the bright lights, which has to do with a Syrian refugee camp near our university in Iraqi Kurdistan. But anyway, because it's grim, I like to cover a couple of bright lights. There are, in a seemingly darkening world, there's some wonderful things happening, and individual citizens can do a lot and make a difference. So let me start and talk about the Kurds. This is a map of the current Middle East, just to focus you on where we are, where Iraq sits in this. It's really the crossroads of the Middle East, and it has been historically was ancient Mesopotamia that we all read about in the Old Testament and other sources. But this has only been the case for the last 100 years, because there were not those boundaries before France and Germany, following World War I, sat down at a table with the map of what had formerly been the Ottoman Empire and drew a lot of lines that created a lot of countries that had never been there before. So if you look at the layout before World War I, you see the Ottoman Empire and what it covered. And if you look now at the lines that have been drawn, you see a lot of separate states, where before there was no Iraq, there was no Syria, there was no Jordan, and Iran was as it was, but Turkey certainly didn't look like that. There really wasn't a Turkey before World War I. So this is what it looked like before World War I. We're going to really quickly go over those 100 years of history. But this is where the Kurds are. So if you look at the pink and the orange, that's Kurdish territory. That's where the Kurds are. So in order to talk about the Kurds, I have to talk about the Kurds in 4 or 5 different countries that they weren't in before. They didn't live with those kind of boundaries. They were a group in a large geographical area, but really a common area. And then after World War I, all these boundaries and these new states got drawn by the British and the French, who were looking at their own interest, and particularly oil, and really literally sat down and drew up a treaty. They were the victors in World War I. They could do what they wanted, but not quite, and I'll say more about that. But the red is where we are in northern Iraq, called Iraqi Kurdistan. I'm going to particularly talk about Iraq, the Kurds in Iraq, for a very good reason, that the Kurds have always, since World War I and the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, they'd been part of the Ottoman Empire, no boundaries. But since that time, the Kurds have really sought to have an independent state of their own. They really realize that's the only way, not only to have that kind of cultural connection, but it's also just to defend yourself. And they were certainly promised that after World War I, and then it's a promise that went by the wayside. But anyway, this is where Kurds are. So, you know, the majority really are over in Turkey, eastern Turkey. We'll talk a little bit about that. Iran and Iraq have about the same number of Kurds. Syria, 2 million. We've heard a lot about those 2 million Syrian Kurds in the last couple of years. And finally, there's some Kurds in Armenia, not very many, and I won't talk much about them, nor about the Kurds in Iran, who've had what I want to say, have probably assimilated and have a little bit of a quieter history. So let me just say, this is looking at Iraq. This is how Iraq plays out in terms of its ethnicity, with the Kurds in the north. The Sunni and Shia, both Muslim divisions. I'll say a little bit more about that so you'll understand where that came from. The Shia primarily in the south, the Sunni in the central, and the Kurds in the north. People often ask me about, I'm going to Iraq, and they're, oh, do you wear body armor, and so on and so forth. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. Iraqi Kurdistan is a very stable place. It hasn't seen any of the fighting and the violence and the turmoil that the south has. They have their own army up there called the Pesmerga, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But anyway, this is what it looks like. So the Kurds have always lived in the mountains in that area, eastern Turkey, northern Iraq. It looks like that. This is the city of Sulamani, where our university is. So, you know, it's a very modern city, and they've had a chance for the last 30 years under some protection by the US, and I'll talk about how that came about, really to be settled, to be stable, and to have a lot of economic investment go on. And it's a pretty prosperous place, except, you know, the last 6-7 years have been pretty tough on them economically, with all the turmoil, with the issue of fighting ISIS in the area. This is just a picture of a mall. So this is a very modern kind of place, just so you know. People have different kind of stereotypes and thinking about what different parts of the world look like. One of the things I love about our forum here is the opportunity to look internationally and learn more about what's going on. America, separated by 2 big oceans, often can be pretty insular, and we don't always know about what's going on and where other actions are happening. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Iraqi Kurds, because they're the one group of Kurds that have had success in achieving some independence. They live in an autonomous region up in northern Iraq. And the Iraqi Kurds have their own parliament. And on the right is Masoud Barzani, who was formerly the prime minister. His son now, over on the left, is now prime minister. Down in the south is Barham Saleh, who was was a prime minister in the Iraqi Kurdish government. So they have their own parliament, they elect their own prime minister, and they're self-governing to some degree. But like any state in the Union, it's a federal system. So they're Iraqis and they're subject to the central government of Iraq and to the Constitution of Iraq, but sort of like state government, like California or Texas or Nevada, we have our own state governments and are self-governing to some degree inside a larger federal system. That's the case with Iraqi Kurdistan, and the Kurds in other countries in Iraq would love to have this kind of arrangement. But it hasn't all been a bed of roses, and they've had to fight hard to get it. Barham Saleh now in the corner, there's now the Iraqi president of Iraq. The constitution that we helped devise after invading in 2003 requires that the prime minister be a Shia, that the president be a Kurd, and the head of the assembly be a Sunni Muslim. But anyway, what you need to know is that's their own, they have their own government. So let me say a little bit more about, I promised to talk a little culturally about the Kurds. So let me see what I can cover in a short period of time. They have a long ethnic history. They've been around for, 4,000 to 5,000 years. This has been the crossroads of the world, really, the known world in the early days. And the reason that they're such great warriors has to do that they've been invaded so many times by all the empires, the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, the Islamic Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and they've learned how to try to protect their borders and their own cultural identity. So they've been around there a long time. They've always lived up. They've been kind of mountain people. They were pastoralists, really, mountain kind of stuff that they did until the French and the English drew all these borders. And then if you are a people that are pastoralists and you're trying to look for good pastures and you can't cross borders, complicate your life, and so many more now are farmers than pastoralists. They're the largest ethnic group without a country of their own. They're largely Sunni Muslim in Iraq. Over in Turkey, there's about 30% that are Shia Muslim, a group called Alevi, like Christianity. There are a lot of divisions within divisions, and the Alevis are about 30% of the Kurds over in Turkey. They have their own language. It's related to Persian, by the way, not related to Arabic, although, Kurds have learned to speak the language of the country they reside in. So most of them up in Kurdistan are trilingual, certainly Kurdish and Arabic. Many speak English as well, because many are learning English, particularly in the American university. Nobody knows how many there are. Probably, 30 million. The reason is that a lot of these countries don't do in their census, they don't want to know ethnic identity because they want assimilation. So in Iran, in Turkey, Iraq, a lot of these places doing a census, they don't ask whether you're a Kurd or not. So it's hard to know. But, probably somewhere around 30 million. And the picture on the right shows the Pesmerga. And the Pesmerga, and I can't go into all that history, but it's interesting, are particularly Iraqi Kurds. And they came together. They were always kind of border guards, like tribal border guards, managing the tribal boundaries. And then they came together after World War I and dividing up the place. And that's when they first really saw an opportunity to be independent. So they became fighters to advance a national movement of the Iraqi Kurds particularly. And they had a lot of success in Iraq for a lot of good reasons that happened because of the way Iraq was formed after World War I. So this is a slide that sort of gives you some sense about where people are. And some sites, I'll mention Mount Sinjar is when a major battle took place against ISIS, who came in and captured the Yazidis, who were left defenseless by both the Iraqi army and actually the Kurdish Pesmerga. They were the ones that captured the women and children into sex slavery. But you see where Iraqi Kurdistan is, how close we are to Mosul, and the part that was involved when ISIS invaded the territory and took over up until that line. So the Peshmerga really got into gear more than any time in the past that they had to defend their territory. And one of the things we know about the Pesmerga is that there are women involved in the Pesmerga as well. But the Pesmerga, and it's a Pesmerga means those willing to die. The Pesmerga were really instrumental in the fact that the Iraqi Kurds end up with their own place, their own autonomous region, their own self-government. Because from the time of after World War I, and they became a nationalist force, they just started fighting against what had been imposed on them in Iraq. And they weren't the only ones. Just to say a few things about, because people are always curious about culture. And the fact that women now, and you've seen them in all the pictures when you look over at the fighting going on and you see who the fighters are, both on the Syrian side, but these are Peshmerga soldiers. These women were allowed into the Peshmerga after 1990. In 1990, when Saddam Hussein went after the Kurds had supported Iran in the Iran and Iraq War, and he went after the Kurds. And they needed all the power, the military power they could get, so they welcomed women into the ranks. They initially weren't trained to fight in combat, although later in the fight against ISIS, they were right there in the front lines, and you've seen them. Initially, they were given posts that were more supportive, whether it was in hospitals or whatever. But anyway, like all the countries in the Middle East, there's just a diverse. These women over on the right are ministers in the government, and then what you find, as you find in any cultural group, that the rurals are more conservative, the cities are more progressive. Sulamani, where our American university is a very sort of progressive, more Western-leaning society. So, I mean, it's women are engineers, women are teachers, women are doctors, women are lawyers. The Constitution of Iraq requires that 25% of the government posts be given to women. And so they have a lot of opportunities for leadership. But, it only goes so far. They're not Saudi Arabia. I mean, they can be out there and in their professions and in government and have, entirely a lot of freedom in comparison. But, it is a traditional society as well, and certain traditional things are expected. The Kurds are a very, very family-focused group, as all the Middle Eastern cultures are. Certainly it's true of the Arabs, but family is central, family loyalties are central, and so on and so forth. And, on the right, that's, we were there for, during Ramadan and the breaking of the fast, and boy, the food is just plentiful, and it's just that families gather on Friday, which is their holy day, or Sunday. They all gather in the home of their parents or the grandparents or whatever and get together. But family loyalties are really very strong. And one of the things that I love to remind people is there are a lot of cultures in the world that respect their elders in a very, very demonstrative way. And certainly that isn't the case in our society, but throughout the Middle East, you'll always see that kind of respect shown. So a real centrality to family, food, hospitality, like all the cultures of the Middle East, welcoming the stranger, taking care of people is just at the heart of Islam. The best of Islam, really. Unfortunately in the West, the image of Islam has been really influenced by a very small extremist group that takes the mantle, pretends the mantle of the Islamic religion to accomplish political goals, but the other 90% of Muslims, it's a very noble religion in so many ways, but one of the basic tenets is caring for the poor, which I see all the time when I'm over there, welcoming the stranger. That's why all those countries, none of whom can afford it, have taken in all the refugees. They do, and they provide for them. That's just part of what you do if you're an Islamic nation. So what else? I want to say something about the religion. In Iraq, there's a division in Islam between Sunni and Shia. I'll say a little bit more about that, but they're predominantly Sunni because that is the predominant division in Islam. But there are others too. There are Zoroastrians, which is goes back several millennium. that exist. These are all much smaller groups. The Yazidis I mentioned that were targets for ISIS particularly, Christians, Jews, other kind of smaller groups. You know, the Middle East is really just a mosaic that has different kind of divisions according to ethnicity and religion, but there are many minor sects, you know, that are part of Islam or not, that maybe relate to ancient religions, which the Yazidis and the Zoroastrians both do, but then there are Mandaeans and Druze over in Israel, a lot of smaller groups. And one of the nice things about it is throughout the Middle East, there's quite a tolerance for different religions. Now, that's not true in Saudi Arabia. It's just Muslim or the highway. But throughout the rest of the Middle East, there's so much diversity, religious diversity, even though Islam is absolutely dominant in all these places, that there's a lot of tolerance. And some places are more secular and some less so. So what you always find in religion, within a religion, some practice and some don't, and some practice some of the time. So you see that around festivals, and Ramadan is the holy month of fasting, and maybe I'd say up where I spend some time in Kurdistan, maybe 40 to 50% of the people practice the fasting. And I'll tell you they're tough because in the summer months, and it was that way last May when I was there, you know, it's dawn to dark, no food, no water, nothing. And you're supposed to be reflecting on who you've been and looking at your own failings and looking at how to live a better life, because it's part of what Muslims are called to look at themselves and live a more godly, holy life. So anyway, that's a little bit about the religion. I'm going to now try to cover a lot of history in a short period of time. And I'm going to focus a bit on Iraq, but then move to Turkey and Syria as well. So this is the Ottoman Empire. This is World War I. This is what the place looked like. You see there are no boundaries down there in the south. And so the Ottomans really sided with the Germans. I believe they were called the Axis, and we were the Allies were France and Britain. And as you know, we came in at the very end of World War I to be part of that alliance as well. So what happened is the Allies won. And France and Britain literally said, okay, the spoils of war, we got this. We defeated the Ottomans. They had some help from the Arabs, by the way, Lawrence of Arabia, if you've seen that movie. So what do we do with the Ottoman Empire? And so they just drew a lot of lines, and you saw where those lines were. That's when Iraq was created as a state. There was no Iraq before this time. I have to tell you, to our own credit, because we bear a lot of guilt when we look at the Middle East contemporarily and policies, mistakes we've made. But I have to say, President Wilson was at that table. Now, we'd come in late in the war, and it was Britain and France that had the big armies and really defeated Germany. But we had a seat at the table, and President Wilson, to his credit, said, no, I don't agree with that. You should be consulting with the indigenous people and letting them make their own choices about how they want to see that divided up, because there'll be more stability if you do that. And anyway, you shouldn't be just imposing your will according to your own economic interests on these people of varying ethnicities and varying religions. Good for President Wilson. We got it right back then. Anyway, this is how it got divided up. And there, as I say, there wasn't an Iraq and a Syria and a Jordan. There was a Transjordan, Palestine, Lebanon, all of it. That was all sitting at a table, looking at a map, drawing lines, and deciding how to divide it up. And they did, and oil was certainly a factor to the British. Let me show you this one. Really quickly, here's what happened with Iraq. There was no Iraq. The Brits got that mandate. They said, we'll take Iraq. And they did, and they owed a favor to Prince Faisal, who'd been the Prince of Mecca. Because if you watched Lawrence of Arabia, you know that the British engaged the Arabs to help push the Turks out of that part of the Middle East. So, and it was this guy Faisal who got all his men together and worked with the British to throw the Turks out. So the Brits said, we really owe this guy something. We just carved up this state, Iraq, we'll make him the king. So they made him the king. Now, he's a Sunni Arab, the Hashemites are. By the way, the Hashemites are still the ruling family in Jordan. King Abdullah and his father Hussein and so forth. They're all the Hashemites. These are old tribal names, by the way. But anyway, so they put him in there, and there was huge resistance to it. The Kurds certainly did, because frankly, they'd been promised a homeland by the French and the British. And they said, well, we'll carve off something and we'll give you a homeland, cooperate with us, work with us here, and so on and so forth. Well, in the end of the day, it wasn't really a priority to the British and the French, and they were quick to sell the Kurds out. That's a story that started 100 years ago that's continued ever since. So anyway, one of the things that King Faisal said, after he'd been there for 5 or 10 years, he said, the funny thing, there are no Iraqi people inside Iraq. And of course there weren't. Nobody there had been consulted. They didn't see themselves as part of this new entity, and so saw no reason to feel any loyalty to it. I point that out to you because really the result of that is that Iraq has had these fracture lines built in since the very beginning. It's like it's been the loyalty to your particular group rather than any sense of national loyalty, because nobody asked your permission to put you inside of a new nation called Iraq. So, I mean, that's a very telling thing. Lack of cohesion, turbulence, divisions have continued right through their history. But the Shia in the Sunni in Iraq stayed in power clear until we deposed Saddam Hussein. So I'm just going to hit a couple of things. But from the very beginning, you see, because of these fracture lines, it was fragile. There wasn't a cohesion, a national cohesion to it. You know, the British stayed until 58, by the way. They had the guns, they had the big armies, and they had to keep continually putting down rebellions by the Kurds and by the Shia and by others who had never agreed. It was really 45 that Mustafa Barzani organized the Kurds in something called the Kurdish Democratic Party. Still exists today. You saw his son and his grandson, who now are, you know, prime minister of the Kurdish regional government. But anyway, and finally a military coup dispatched the British. The Kurds always kept fighting for their independence. They were finally, because the Iraqi army got tired of fighting them, said, just go up there in the mountains and be quiet, and we'll leave you alone. Because you see, by that time, the Pesmerga had come together, and they're a pretty good fighting force. These battles went back and forth between the Kurds and the Iraqi army, and lots were killed. You know, during one long period, 100,000 people were killed. But they just always kept fighting. And then in 75, Sulamani, another kind of, comes out of a tribal derivation, formed the PUK. Those are the two political parties. I mention it because if you're looking at Iraqi Kurdistan, you got to understand there are two political parties there, the KDP and the PUK. Don't worry about the acronyms. And they don't get along. And they look a little bit like the Republicans and the Democrats these days. Now, a big difference up in Iraqi Kurdistan, they each have an army. Now, imagine Texas with an army. Yeah. So, because to cover a lot more history, what happened, I'll get to it, but you know, so they really were kind of said, the Iraqis were tired of it, they had bigger fish to fry. Remember, they get into a big war with Iran, and this is what happens, 1980 to 1988, Iraq and Iran, major war, killed 1 million people, which is tragic. It ended up a stalemate. The United Nations finally stepped in and said, quit it, you guys, you're not getting anywhere. From the time of the Iranian Revolution, the Iraqi government was very scared about Iran and thought that they would come in and try to take the part of Iraq that is composed of Shia, because that's the religious continuity. Iran is very much Shia Muslim, and the Shias, of course, were the majority always in Iraq, but the British imposed a Sunni government, so the Shia were never happy with that to begin with. But anyway, so they got in this war right after the Iranian Revolution. We supported the Iraqis, by the way, sent a lot of weapons. We were pretty mad about the Iranians and taking our embassy, right? So anyway, that happened. But what happened with the Kurds was they supported Iran. And boy, you can imagine that upset the Iraqi government, central government, and Saddam Hussein, and he went after them in what's called the Kurdish Anfal campaign, a kind of a genocide. And he was so furious, he took his army, he went up and he said, okay, that's it. No more autonomy, we're just taking over. So that's when the women Pesmerga particularly were inducted into a fighting force to try to defend what they had. But the Kurds fled. There were chemical weapons used. They went up to the mountains and they just dispersed. Well, we got into this. I've already talked about the Peshmerga and their history, so I'm going to skip over that. We got into this. So if you recall, Saddam invaded Kuwait. We pushed him out. And then he went after, wanted to go after the Kurds again. And we protected them. We established a no-fly zone in 1992 and said we won't let Saddam Hussein's army come in. You can protect yourself. So the Peshmerga really became the defense force up there in Iraq. And since that time, 1992, we've stayed, have had an ally with them. Later, when we invaded Iraq in 2003, the Kurds were all for it because they hated Saddam Hussein. He'd gone after them and killed so many in that campaign of his. But anyway, from that time on, we defended their space. They were able to all come back. There was quite a diaspora. Many came back, and under that stability, we were able to really pull together their own government and prosper economically. I say pull together their own government. Don't forget they're too big, the PUK and the KDP. Well, guess what? In 1993, after we had said, we'll protect you, they got into a big civil war. And then we had to finally come in at about 1995 and say, whoa, we're not going to protect you anymore if you're going to fight with each other. They'd killed about 100,000 people. And it was Kurds fighting Kurds, like these two major political divisions, political parties. We said, okay, and so they said, okay, and had a truce. But the way they formed it was for every ministry in the Kurdish government, you had to have one member of the PUK and one member of the KDP in each ministry. That was the only way to divide it up, and they each kept their own part of the Peshmerga, and they still have them today. But you can imagine one of the reasons the Kurds have been able to defend their autonomous region is, they have an army to do that, and the Iraqi army leaves them alone. That's kind of an agreement. Okay, you defend up there. That's why when ISIS headed towards Erbil after they'd taken Mosul, it was the Kurds defending their own space, and they did a good job of it. Now I'm sorry, it's a little bit fuzzy, but let me talk about Turkey really quickly and how this fits into it. Because here you had, the majority of the Kurds ended up in Turkey. Okay, France and England had promised the Kurds, we'll carve you out over in eastern Turkey, northern Iraq, we'll give you a homeland. That was the treaty in 1920. What happened in Turkey was a nationalist movement developed under a leader called Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. He's their national hero, like George Washington is ours. Turkey, it's Ataturk. Nationalist movement. Now remember, they'd been part of the Ottoman Empire, and they had actually fought the Germans, not in any major way, but they had an army. And so when France and England were doing this drawing, and this nationalist movement started, they had the agency, the military agency, to draw their own boundaries. There was a fight. The British and the French said, we're done. We won World War I. We're done. We're not going to fight anymore. You can have it. So Turkey drew its own boundaries, as they are today, and there was no Kurdistan. And they became quickly recognized by the nations, and finally, 51, I think it was, a member of NATO. The Ataturk had established a very sectarian, a very non-sectarian, secular government, rather westernized, really. And that's gone by the wayside more recently under Erdogan. But anyway, that's the story. Now, were the Kurds in Turkey happy about that? No. They said, wait a minute, we were promised a homeland. But Turkey had the guns, the army said, no, you assimilate. We're all going to be Turks now. See, there hadn't been a Turkey before, but they were what was left of the Ottoman Empire, let's say, common language. Anyway, and so they wanted the Kurds to assimilate. They said, speak our language. We don't want Kurdish taught in the schools. we want you to assimilate. We're a country now. We're going to be Turkey, and you're part of Turkey. Turkey citizens first, Kurdish second. But, you know, the Kurds have always fought for their cultural identity, and they've not wanted to assimilate. And so that has caused a real fight. So this just shows where they are in Turkey, and how they, from early on, they just fought for their own independence. But it took a negative turn in 1978 when a guy named Öcalan, who was a Turkish Kurd, said, okay, that's it, we're done talking to you about it. We want our independence, and we'll fight for it. And they started fighting. They got the guns, they got bombs, and guerrilla warfare, and they became a pretty violent group fighting for Turkish independence Kurdish independence in the Turkish state. They ended up, that's a long story too. Öcalan is still alive actually, but he organized something called the PKK. And they were the Kurdish, and not all Kurds in Turkey, by the way, agreed with this. They said, that's not a good strategy. Let's not be a violent group. They'll come back at us with violence. And of course they did. So, but anyway, they finally captured Öcalan. They were going to execute him, but they wanted to join NATO, and NATO said, we don't believe in the death penalty. You want to come in our club? Don't do it. So they put him out on an island in the Mediterranean. He's still there, still very much the head of the Turkish Kurdish PKK. So I mention that because you've heard a lot about them, because they have down in Syria, their affiliate militia in Syria is called the YPG. And that's been Turkey's big concern in what's gone on over the last decade. So the PKK is a political party has been designated by the US and Europe and everybody else as a terrorist organization, still is, because they decided that was their strategy and what they would use to get independence. Anyway, so that's why Erdogan in Turkey is pretty scared of the Syrian Kurds, because they have this affiliation. Their militias operate under the YPG, which is associated with the PKK, which surely did most of the training and so on and so forth. What about Syria? You look over there, and that's where they were in the east. And then you see how when they started fighting ISIS, this is where the YPG was really the trained Syrian Kurds, and for their own militia, they fought successfully, and they were able to capture a lot more territory, set up their own government, their own kind of autonomous government. Because listen, Syria was in the midst of a civil war since the revolution, and Assad had his hands full with all that he was trying to do against his opposition, which still exists, but they seem to be driving him out of Idlib now very violently. But anyway, and so for 3-4 more years, they captured that. They established their own kind of modeled after what was going on in northern Iraq with the Iraqi region up there. And so, but you can see what Turkey wanted was a buffer, because they feel very strongly, look, these guys are affiliated with their own internal terrorist group that's, fights our national army, and so we want a buffer zone. That's what the issue was. As you know, Erdogan and Trump were in negotiation. Trump was willing to give them that. And then on a whim, hard to know why, he pulled our small troops out that were really protecting the Syrian Kurds who'd fought for all that territory. And the minute we left, they lost the whole thing. Because then Turkey came in and said, okay, you're not going to give me a buffer zone, I'm going to get it. And Assad again started north, thinking, okay, I can take over that part as well. It's more complicated than that, but that's just sort of the overview. But I want to tell you something about Islamic history. So Islam was founded in the 7th century with the Prophet Muhammad. And if you read the history, it was a very turbulent, warlike time. The Roman Empire was fading, so that there were a lot of local, smaller groups fighting each other. It was very turbulent and violent. So when the Prophet Muhammad arrived with a message that unified people and calling them to a holier life and work in community and pulling them together, Islam spread all over the known world at the time, clear up through Spain, as you know, and so it became the Islamic Empire. But here's what happened. Right after the Prophet's death, there was a big argument about who should be his successor. And it split between a group that wanted Ali and a group that wanted Abu Bakr. One was a relative of his, another had been his most devoted follower. Anyway, big split. They fought it out. But early on, unlike Christianity, which didn't divide for a few centuries, and then a lot more, and then kept dividing, same thing really, similar pattern. But initially it was the Shia and the Sunni. But here's what you need to know, is Sunni Islam is the dominant form. Maybe 90% of Muslims are Sunni Muslims, but a very small percentage, 10+%, are Shia. Now what there is to know is Sunni Islam spread all over the world. You can see down in Indonesia and so on and so forth. But Shia Islam stayed in a narrow, what's called the Shia Crescent. And you see where that is in Iraq, down in the south of Iraq, which is very much part of the Shia Crescent. I had a slide here I wanted to show you, but let's see if I can go back and find it. Yep, got it. So anyway, what is called the Shia Crescent is Iran, Shia over Lebanon. And that's where the Shia live. What you need to understand Iraq is that the connection between Iraq and Iran, because there wasn't an Iraq before 100 years, is very tied to Shia Islam, where the Shia are the majority, and we put them into power in our invasion, and of course they are very closely aligned with Allah. But there's a religious thing to a lot of the shrines of the Shia are over in southern Iraq. 20,000 million people annually come across to worship at shrines. I mean, there's a very tight connection. That's why with the recent concern that we might go to war with Iran, it would tear Iraq apart. They're very close allies with Iran, and not just because they're neighbors and you know to get along with your neighbors and you work out your differences, but because of that very strong Shia crescent. So, the rest of the story, you know it. We invaded. We dismissed all the Baathists catastrophically, it turns out, after toppling Hussein, who was a Sunni. And then that's why the Shia, then the majority, became dominant, close ties with Iran. That's why Iranian influence has really grown in Iraq, because it's no longer a Sunni government. The power is with the Shia. The Sunni, who were all fired from their government jobs, and most of them were, really became people who had no means of support, a small minority group there was quite a lot of payback going on. Al-Qaeda and ISIS result out of that. Okay, points of light. Let me tell you something about the American University of Iraq. I want to say something about American education. It's so important. People always ask me, what does it mean? Does it mean America owns it? No. There are American universities all over the world. American University of Beirut, American University of Cairo, American University of Rome, American University of Paris. What it means is the American style of education. Let me tell you what that encompasses, because I think it's really great. So most of these countries, you graduate from high school, you're tracked. You want to be an engineer? High school, track. You study engineering. Medicine, study medicine. Dentistry, pharmacy, whatever. You just go right into it. The American style of education, our colleges and universities require a 2-year general core. 2 years where you study generally. You study about history and literature and religion and geography and different cultures and all sorts of things, because we believe that's how you educate people. And they end up with a wide portfolio of knowledge. They're broadly educated. They can be critical thinkers that can think across differences and hold two contrasting thoughts at the same time, and dialogue and so forth. We're so proud of what we're doing, being an American university. You should meet some of our students. It's also American universities teaching English. But the other thing we do, it's like a lot about soft power. Military power only goes so far, the guns. But if you want to establish stability afterwards, it's all about soft power. It's all about civic institutions. It's all about places like education and educational institutions. So we're really proud that we've got this form of American education, and our graduates not only speak fluent English, but they also are critical thinkers in every way. And so that's just something about our university, a little picture of some of our students. We're very proud of this group who won the national competition in moot court. They're going to be lawyers. and came to the United States to defend it internationally and did very well. We were very proud of him. Anyway, and my last thing, and it's really important for me to say this because we tend to, it's a long way away, we read horror stories, they're refugees, Syrian refugees, and we don't have the heart for them that I have to tell you I do, because I visited the Arbat refugee camp last year when I was there, and I'll visit it again. You know, Syrians were very well-educated people. A lot of the people in this camp, the parents were professional people. You lose everything in the middle of bombing, violence, you just flee. They want their kids to have an education. So the bright light of this story is that a wonderful woman 2.5 years ago, Florence, a French artist, came with her husband who was going to be COO of a big company up in Sulamani, and came out to this camp and said to the director, listen, I'd like to teach these kids art. He said, well, we have UN camp. We have no budget for that. She said, I'll bring it all. She brought it all. So for 1.5 years, she taught these kids art, drawing, and then she taught them, because she's a mural artist, how to put them up on their buildings, their drab cinder block buildings, which is what refugee camps look like. And so she had them do them on paper, then cover the cinder blocks with a kind of surface that can handle a mural, and had them all working on that. And this became just a huge project for them, and very transformative as art can be. And she supported the whole thing herself. This one said Yusuf's lunch and the watermelon. You just gotta love that. You know, the sad thing about refugees is their opportunities are so limited, they've lost everything. And so a very small percentage of refugees across the world have access to higher education. And so this is, in the case in Iraq, and refugees there, 13% through UN programs, but most don't have that opportunity. Florence came back and she established a foundation and have been raising money ever since. I just went down to a fundraiser in Palo Alto last week to help her out. And it's scholarships to these kids to our university. And so far, we've got 7 or 8 going there. We've got more in the pipeline, and it's changed the atmosphere. The murals changed the camps, and the program changed the camps. It gives them hope. And these students now are just working so hard to qualify for those kinds of scholarships, because the last thing I want to say is one of the things about Kurdish families, so tight, Arab families across the Middle East, you educate one kid, it saves the family. And it saves the family because they'll look out for the whole family. They will make sure their brothers and sisters get that kind of education and their parents get settled. You know, that's the way it works. So it really is just touching and inspiring. So there are a few wonderful things going on over there. And that's the end of my presentation.
So leave it to the chair of the board to present an entire semester course in 45 minutes. So you can, why don't you just stay there, because you're very animated. So okay. I'll give you some questions. So on to the, you ended on the ethnic issues and the notion of family. There's a perception that various sects in the Middle East are not as accepting as of different groups. So could you give us a little insight as to why you think the Kurdish society has been accepting of Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians into their midst when others are not?
Well, let me just say again, the other that isn't is really Saudi Arabia. An awful lot of the rest of the Middle East, because there are, they've been around for a long time, 4 and 5 millennium. A lot of different groups have formed. So everywhere you go in the Middle East, there are a lot of different religious groups. They tend to be, they're minorities if they're not Muslim, but there tends to be a very wide tolerance, and there always had been. It's a misperception in the West that Islam hasn't been tolerant. I could give you some history about, in the spread of Islam, what the Prophet said is, don't fight with people of the book. And people of the book are the Christians and the Jews, because the Muslims share the Old Testament with us. They honor Jesus actually as a Messiah. They just consider their prophet, Muhammad, the last prophet to come to tell people how to come together and live a holy life. So there's a lot of similarity. They say people of the book, they mean Christians, Jews, along with the Muslims. So there's a wide tolerance there, and Jewish groups as well. Now, ISIS, a sad thing is ISIS has projected an image that is a completely false one, but it's a narrow Islamic extremist group that has just engaged in horrendous tactics under the guise of Islam. It's not about Islam, it's about political gain. But religion works well trying to get people to come to your side, say it's all about God wants us to do this. But so I want to say that across the Middle East you find a wide tolerance because you find so many groups. What's Lebanon? A third Christian and a third Shia and a third Sunni. And then there are the Maronites and, the Druze. So you go around and the Circassians and then there are Armenians. There are so many different ethnic groups and religious sects that there is a wide tolerance. It's not true in Saudi Arabia, but I can't think of anywhere else, that it isn't. Even, over there in Bahrain, which is close to Saudi Arabia. When I lived in Saudi Arabia, I used to fly out and go to the Anglican Church out there. So that's, there's just a lot of tolerance, but not in Saudi Arabia.
Excellent. Okay, so let's pull the thread a little bit on what you said about the situation in Turkey, with Turkey and the Turkish Kurds. We know that we pulled out and Turkey came in. That's caused the Kurds in that region, the YPG, to lose ground. So, question for you is, if you could look in your crystal ball, what would have happened if we hadn't pulled out? Do you think the situation would have continued as it was? Would it have deteriorated? What would have been the other tripping point to get it to change? And then the last question is, exactly who is Turkey fighting now?
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, let me answer the first part of that. Yeah, we had a seat at the table. Turkey didn't go in until we left. We had a small group there. What we were talking about, 1,500, 2,000, I don't know, small troop presence. But we had a seat at the table. And actually, Trump and Erdogan had been in quite a discussion about this, and Trump was sympathetic to Erdogan's concerns. He said, give me a buffer. Those guys are related to the terrorist group we got here over in the east, and they scare me, and we don't want to have to defend our border against a group that's going to be hostile to us. And Trump and Erdogan were talking about that. It was a negotiation. We had a seat at the table, and obviously we were making the difference because Turkey didn't come in. And then I don't know that any of us know exactly about those conversations, but Trump suddenly decided to pull out, and Erdogan said, "Okay, we're taking it. We're not going to get it in the negotiating table. We got a big army. We'll take it," and came in, and so. There's that fight going on, except the Syrian Kurds now have lost so much ground that they've really pulled back. I mean, the mistaken belief is that ISIS is done. It's not done at all. And when I read the Iraqi newspapers, there are attacks going on down in the south, not where we are, up in the north, because we have a pretty tough Pesmerga defending things. But, ISIS is still around. The Syrian Kurds just gave up because Assad was going to go after them from the south. He headed north with his troops. He didn't want an independent Syrian state. They had been part of Syria historically. They were all Syrians, and all of a sudden they're wanting their own autonomy, set up their own government, a very democratic kind of government, similar to the Iraqi model up in Iraqi Kurdistan. But when we were gone, then Assad comes after them this direction. Assad doesn't want Turkey to have a buffer zone in what he sees as the former boundaries of Syria, the boundaries of Syria, and Erdogan's determined to have it. So, that's the fight going on, but you got some big guns on Assad's side because you've got Moscow in there that's flying a lot of planes and bombing a lot of hospitals. It's really, when you see the pictures of those 600,000 Syrians fleeing Idlib these days, it just breaks your heart. They're trying to grab their bodies from the bombed ruins and so on and so forth. So that's what's going on. And, that hasn't really been resolved. Assad's determined to get back to his boundaries. The Syrian Kurds have lost their ground. And Turkey's still quite determined. We'll see that Turkey and Moscow, I guess, and Assad are going to have to work this one out.
Excellent. Well, yes.
If they can.
That's for another presentation. So when you look at where, from your vantage point, I mean, you spend a lot of time up in Sulamani. You see the perspective of the Middle East as it's shifted. You gave us the 100-year history that sort of forced the existence of these countries. And then, of course, we know where we got to in 9/11 and the war on terror. Use the Jill Derby perspective and say, where do we go from here? Well, does this end? And where, I mean, is the U.S. benefiting by being more engaged or less engaged?
Well, listen, I believe the U.S. needs to be engaged in the world. We live in a global world now with so many cross-cutting issues. I don't think there's any, and of course I regret that our leadership role in the world has been tarnished. I understand why a lot of Americans are very frustrated with what's going on. I mean, it just seems like it doesn't go well. We invade, and it doesn't go well. It's certainly the case with Iraq. You know, when I first visited Baghdad way back in the late 60s or 70s as a kid out of college traveling the world, it was a wonderful city and wonderful access to higher education and women's rights. You know, Iraq has had the most turbulent history. It's fractured from the beginning by the way it was established, and so on and so forth. But so you're sort of asking me about the future, I think, is at the heart of that. I want to tell you another bright light is the protests that have been going on in Iraq that the Iraqi militias, mind you, Iraq has militias that are more loyal to Iran than Iraq, and Iraq has been trying to get them all inside their own military with some success, not entirely. But you can imagine the killing of Sulamani has fractured that whole arrangement. Here's the good news in Iraq, is the protesters that you've been reading about for months now on the streets, what they're protesting is they want the sectarian arrangement that we rejiggered when we came in and helped them draft a constitution that divided it according to sectarian groups. The Shia will have this and the Sunni that, and then the Kurds will have that in terms of position. So then you ended up with a very corrupt arrangement because then you got patronage. Then you got the head of the party who's sort of head of this and head of that. Patronage, why the Iraqi army fell apart and couldn't fight ISIS for 2 years until we trained them, because Maliki, who was very much a Shia loyalist, appointed all his buddies who were Shia loyalists, didn't know anything about military operations. It was all a patronage system. The youth of Iraq recognized that we can't have this anymore. We want a technocrat government. That means neutral, people that aren't aligned with any particular party. We want to be Iraqis. It's sort of the first time you see a Iraqi nationalist movement after 100 years of fractured history. I find that very encouraging. That's a whole new development. That's what they want. Sadly, the Iraqi militias and military have just been brutal in trying to suppress that. And then I know, because Barham Saleh was our former chair, I know him, he's the Iraqi president now, trying to negotiate that and figure out how to put in a new government. He just has, Alawi. It's not going to satisfy them because it's only, you know, a stone's throw away from a political group. It's hard when you're dealing with political groups and all the parties involved.
So I'm going to let you end on one question that I hope has that ray of light in it, which is, you've done a lot today to help us understand the complex history of both the Kurdish people, but, you know, a short course on the Islamic history. How do we take this back into our own culture and sort of undo the negative stigma that's been associated with Muslims in this country and recapture the beauty and the light that you tried to shine on us today?
Yeah, you know, I just have to say, if you were to go with me when I'm over in the Middle East, when I'm up in Kurdistan, and go visit my friends, the Taha, who invited us over for dinner to break the fast, you are just really struck by the warmth, you know, this natural kind of warmth and hospitality and looking out for others. That's the very heart of Islam. If you study Islam, know anything about Islam, listen, the wonderful thing, and these days you can Google anything. But the heart of Islam is the 5 pillars of Islam, and they're noble goals. They're calling people to a holier life, but they're pointing to the underserved and the poor. And almsgiving is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. I'm always there. I'm in a taxi. The taxi stops because there's somebody on a corner that's asking for money. He always rolls down the window and gives them money. It can take a long time to get across town. But, it's so at the heart of their religion. And the sad thing is here in the West, in the U.S. particularly, we just don't have access to the bigger story. It's what makes headlines, and newspapers want to sell, and so you just any kind of violent incident. But you don't see the everyday life that is really very impressive to me, how Muslims are very proud of their religion, and they're proud of the sort of goodness of it, the communal nature of it. It's very, very communal. It's about families and community. That was at the heart of what the Prophet stressed when he established the religion, was the idea of bring communities together, talk things out, then you elevate your own leaders. It was nothing about dictatorship. You honor other people of the book, but lead a holy life. And nobody knows that in the West. But there's a lot that's available if you're interested. Go online and see what's out there, because it's a fascinating part of the world. It's the oldest, and so much of our civilization as a much later one, it all started back there in Mesopotamia and over in Egypt. It's the Middle East. It's a wonderful place, wonderful people. And I regret that this small extremist group has started with Iraq. It started with disenfranchising a whole huge group of Sunnis who had no other choice but let's get together and fight back. So, I think the best thing is to become more informed about it. And I think I would leave it there. It's a fascinating part of the world. Go find out more about it. You'll find that very rewarding.
Or come talk to Jill afterwards. Yes. So thank you very much, Jill. This was fantastic.